Shey.
Hi, Anna. Wow, it feels so good to be back.
Yeah, it really does. Listeners, we took the whole month of July off.
Well, that's a bit of a stretch, Anna.
Okay. Okay, fine. Well, we didn't record any episodes, so that counts for something.
It sure does.
But we did do some brainstorming. We interviewed a few special guests for upcoming episodes. And
we launched the Teacher Think-Aloud PLN. During our launch party on July 25th, we had just incredible conversations with educators from around the world on the topic of reflective pedagogy. Mm-hmm. And we received input on how we can best support our listeners with their professional development needs.
Woo! It's not too late to join the conversation and the community. Learn more about the PLN, upcoming sessions, and how to become involved by visiting our website at teacherthinkaloud.com/PLN.
So, Anna, we're releasing this episode just before the start of a new term. And the topic for today is quite timely, isn't it?
Yes. Today we're diving into PBL, project-based learning. And if by timely you mean time-consuming, then yeah, I totally agree.
Let's explore that. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shey.
And I'm Anna, and today we're going to look at project-based learning, or PBL.
Anna, I'm so glad it worked out this way. Us getting into PBL a few weeks before the school year starts, at least in the US. Maybe some of our listeners will feel inspired to integrate PBL as they prepare their curriculum before the term starts.
We hope so. So, Shey, let's make sure everyone is on the same page, since PBL, I think, has really gained popularity a lot in recent years. Mm-hmm. How do you understand PBL, Shey?
Yeah, it's definitely become all the rage.
All the rage.
All the rage. In my mind, anyway. Project-based learning is an active learning strategy that engages students in projects that are based on real-world tasks and problems. It's definitely the talk of the town within K through 12 contexts, but it's not always something that adult educators flock to.
Didn't you write on this once?
I did. Listeners, I'll link an article that I wrote for TESOL International a few years ago that offers ways for instructors at the university level to integrate PBL in their settings. But ultimately, an argument that I've heard a lot of is that PBL can be seen as sort of juvenile, that older language learners might be put off when they're told that they're going to do a project in their language class. I think often they cling to what they know. And what they know is often textbook-based, right? For many, it can feel like a roundabout way to get to knowledge.
Right. So student perception might cause adult educators to shy away from PBL. That's certainly true. But there's also the fact that implementing PBL can be, well, kind of a pain in the ass. Pardon my French.
She swore! She swore!
Yeah, it's a lot of work, at least when you're doing it right.
Sure. It takes so much more preparation to lay the ground for successful project-based learning than if you're just like, let's open this textbook and explore this theme, or let's focus on this set of vocabulary words for today. Because there are different moving pieces. It just requires more time up front, and if there's anything that we keep coming back to, it's this idea that teachers don't always have that time up front, right? So I think that's the greatest challenge with PBL.
Actually, in episode 8, Sometimes You Plan, Sometimes You Don't, which was not one of our most popular episodes.
Womp womp. Maybe people felt called out by the title.
Yeah, maybe. So something we talked about in episode 8 is this idea that lesson planning, when we do it lesson by lesson, it can feel like a lot. What we find most effective is when we front load our planning with the curriculum. And that's really the key to PBL. It's like getting all the puzzle pieces to make sense from the very onset, just like having the whole course structure and then planning your lessons around a framework that's already solid and well planned.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. If we plan a course well from the beginning, well, It's a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
But that's the biggest obstacle. And that's what we're arguing is also true of PBL. Once we have that set of overarching goals or that framework, it's easier in future iterations to go back and rework smaller pieces, the building blocks, if you will. So once we do get it done, we can see how manageable and how advantageous it can be from a planning perspective. But upfront, it can be a bit intimidating, sure.
Right. And once we get over that initial intimidation, there are just so many benefits to PBL.
There are. PBL as a concept makes so much sense because students are basically learning through very concrete projects that often have like a real tangible end goal.
Yeah.
PBL engages students in a process of sustained inquiry, right? Asking them to examine challenging problems or questions. And PBL is purpose-driven in that there's a larger project that's concrete, based on real-life scenarios, so it can be super motivating in getting students to engage.
Love that authenticity that comes with PBL. And in addition to it naturally being more engaging because it's learner-centered, a lot of times PBL is tied to some sort of community action. So not only are we promoting active learning, autonomy, collaboration, and building skills that will serve your students later on by using real-life models, we're also heightening their awareness of the world around them, potentially getting them to contribute to causes that hold meaning for them.
We're building global citizens, aren't we?
That's one of the goals, I think.
Yeah. So I do want to maybe expand this notion of community action as a focus of PBL and offer instead the idea that it's grounded in some sort of shared mission. And also in this idea of creating a public product, something that will be seen and valued by others. The traditional PBL does have that sort of community action focus. It often involves like, we're going to create this video or make a presentation to the city council to argue for something we need, a new park or whatever it may be. Like a lot of projects within PBL are related to concrete actions and community engagement. But you can take elements of this framework and insert them in any aspect of a course. It doesn't have to be the whole course, and it doesn't have to be community action only.
Right. It can just be a smaller chunk. Like, we're going to spend these 2 weeks on a very specific project with sub-steps that lead to some kind of final product. What's important is that there's a goal to it, besides just I'm producing language. So you can interpret it in as many ways as you need to. But having that project-driven, that mission-driven kind of aspect to it is really what enriches the class.
Absolutely. I think for someone who has never done PBL, start small with a brief project, but think through every aspect of that project ahead of time. So you create this natural progression, what we've referred to as building blocks. That's the key here. People do projects all the time, right? Like everyone listening has done a project of some sort in their classroom. But it is, I think, more about that augmented intentionality in creating and assigning that project, thinking about how it fits into the larger picture of the course, rather than saying, like, here's a project and it's going to occupy them for 2 weeks, and that's great because that's all we have left in the term.
Yeah, it can be really hard to narrow it down to projects that are going to meet those course objectives, but it's possible. It just takes a little bit of creativity, sometimes ingenuity, and you'll find that PBL has some multitasking powers. You can accomplish so much with just one project. It offers you opportunities to explore language and content in an integrated and seamless way.
Right. You're doing so much more than just rote language instruction, making it really focused and relevant to the task, right? It's definitely focused on function, with that focus on form that comes in naturally. It's communicative language teaching and constructivist theory for the win.
For the win, yeah. I think that being grounded in constructivist theory is part of what makes it wonderful. There are just so many opportunities for, formative assessment throughout.
And reflection.
It's like the epitome of task-based language teaching. I'm a huge proponent of TBLT. I think task design is basically everything, and that really fits beautifully in with what PBL is.
So, Anna, let's talk a bit about some of the ways that we've integrated PBL into our own work.
Yeah, you first.
Well, I mean, you probably can predict which class I'll talk about, but my go-to class is always my journalism and media studies class. It's the only one I ever talk about. I keep coming back to that class. I feel like our listeners know about the class. It's because it was really so successful, and I'm realizing now that maybe that's because it was done with PBL in mind. So the project I'm thinking of was to get each student to create their own e-newspaper by the end of the semester. And so, throughout the semester, students were working on different inserts for their newspapers that necessitated different genres, different structures for writing, different ways to examine the news. Mm-hmm. And the students had free reign, right? They were able to choose topics and themes that were most relevant to them. And there were so many different elements over the course of a 15-week semester. It was really dynamic, but never overwhelming because everything built upon the last component. The last brick laid formed the foundation for the next. So in my mind and in my practice, PBL is a way of ensuring that students are getting everything that they need and continuing to layer one skill over the next. And at the end, you end up with this really beautiful culminating artifact to showcase to the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing example of how PBL can be so realistic, so authentic. Like a newspaper is so tangible, it can be shared with a wide audience.
Yeah, and the tangibility was one piece of it. But this example really plays up the multitasking element of PBL that we mentioned earlier as an affordance. It wasn't just writing inserts for a newspaper. Students were asked to examine other forms of media, create media to accompany the pieces they wrote, do presentations alongside their written pieces, and so much more. Actually, I did a presentation about this specific project at the International TEFL conference this year. I'll link some resources.
Nice. Listeners, we've added Shey's project to our Teachers Pay Teachers account in case you want to download any of her juicy, ready-to-use e-newspaper ideas.
Juicy. Wow. So, Anna, how about you? What PBL have you implemented?
I mean, I've done 2 courses that I designed from scratch that were entirely project-based. And then, of course, I've done smaller projects within courses. But there are 2 that I've done that were entirely PBL that I was really proud of myself for designing it at the time. The first one was very similar to your e-newspaper course, just in a different format. So instead of each individual having their own newspaper, they were group-based. So each newspaper in groups of 3 had its very own editorial team.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another very common thing with PBL, doing things in groups for that collaborative learning.
Yeah, that was the idea. And then the second course, I think, actually turned out great because I had 3 different semesters where I implemented it, and it just got better every time. It was this social media marketing course I did with business communication master's students in Armenia. And so the course started out like in the first few weeks, they were learning about different social media platforms, different marketing theories, things like that. But from the very first 2 weeks, they got into groups and they created their own brand together, from what the product or service was to the logo. And then the majority of the course was dedicated to different steps of building out a social media marketing campaign and implementing it to market their brand. And so they chose the platforms they would use for a social media campaign based on who their audience was. They had to justify every choice they made throughout the campaign. So one major component was there was this campaign proposal that they wrote where they had to justify every step as if they were delivering it to their boss at a company. So they had this ongoing proposal with details of their campaign that they would build on. And then the second component of that was then obviously them creating posts and like working on different engagement strategies and weekly check-ins on this is what we posted at these times. By the end of the whole thing, they had this really complete record of what they had done and why. And they also got to use all of these different formats for creating content. And like they were just so proud of it by the end.
I bet.
English is not their first language. They did all of it in English. And I mean, it was just incredible. It was wonderful. Just very satisfying.
I think that sense of pride that comes when they have a chance either to work in groups and see what they've created together, or even individually. I remember in the journalism and media studies class I highlighted, the students were privy to what their peers were doing and participated in these sort of check-ins. So at the end, when they were all sharing their culminating newspapers, they had this shared sense of pride. It's really incredible.
That was another aspect, I didn't even mention this with this one course that I developed. They worked in groups. So worked in teams for the actual creation and writing together, like creating all of this content together. But then we had feedback sessions in class where their classmates would comment on the effectiveness of different strategies. Obviously, everyone was following each other's brands on socials. So, they were giving each other input like they had this real audience. And so everyone was familiar with everyone's brand. And at the end of the course, they had to do a presentation on like all the choices they had made throughout the course. That was part of their final shebang. This was showing the progress that they had made, and everyone had followed that from the very beginning. And it was cool for them to understand better why they had made these choices.
So that buy-in of PBL is what you're saying, of the whole community of students. I think it's really awesome. I think that something that keeps coming up for me as you're sharing is that the students had to be really pragmatic in the choices that they were making. So there were moments then that they stopped and they documented their reasons for doing things a certain way. I mean, there's just so much critical thinking happening there, making choices and forcing yourself to think about and explain to someone else your rationale. There's opportunity for critique and reflection in these processes.
I mean, it's reflective learning, right? Reflection in action is happening. There's just so much happening there beyond language through the process of being in charge of their project. And that's really that student-centered aspect. It really should not be coming from the instructor. They need to be in charge of all the choices they make at the same time.
Right.
I do want to mention, though, that you and I are talking about all sorts of advanced level projects.
Yeah, sure.
But we're not trying to discourage anyone from PBL for more beginner levels.
Well, I will say I've been successful in using PBL for lower level proficiencies. I worked with a group from Japan a couple of years ago, and we did a research project that ultimately resulted in an infographic gallery walk, and those students were low intermediate. So I do think that when well scaffolded, PBL is possible for any proficiency level. What is necessary, though, is that there is some level of autonomy present within your group of learners. So, the language proficiency is something that we can support, something that we can work around, but there does need to be this autonomy.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that sense, I think PBL for language learners is probably a lot easier when you have adults or, students who are of a certain age. I'm not familiar enough with developmental stages, but like a first grade ESOL student, I don't know how it would work. Maybe it would just take a lot more.
Totally. The teacher would have to have a little bit more of a presence in making decisions, and that's part of scaffolding as well. Actually, one of our listeners, Anya, who works with emergent bilinguals in first and second grade, shared about how she would create projects around themes in her classroom. And these themes corresponded with WIDA standards and language functions. And she shared an example with us where her goal was to get the students to inform on a subject.
Which is pretty vague, seemingly vague at least. And that's where PBL can really come in handy. She could approach that objective from so many angles.
Yeah. So what she shared is that typically the students would start by exploring the function in authentic text and then practicing it. And the end project might be, say, to inform the audience about an animal of their choice. Now, depending on their levels, she'd teach them certain structures using sentence frames of various complexity, and she would do that after teaching them vocabulary. And then after, they'd be paired up to compare and contrast their animal facts and report their findings using compare and contrast language.
Thanks, Anya. That's a concrete example of using scaffolding for projects and how you can integrate PBL components without making it the entire course. So with children, it seems there's just more guidance required throughout the process, and perhaps it's just a smaller, more manageable project.
When there's a will, there's a way. But if you don't know where to start, check out pblworks.org, which offers a framework by the Buck Institute for Education on how to implement project-based learning in your setting. Many of the points we've discussed today align with this framework, so hopefully our examples will help put this framework in perspective, illustrate a bit.
Check it out. So listeners, we'd love to hear from you. How have you integrated project-based learning in your work? What challenges or successes have you encountered? What fresh ideas do you want to try out for the upcoming school year?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
And be sure to check out our upcoming PLN meetups and register at teacherthinkaloud.com/PLN.
Woo! Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching.
And happy reflecting.